Oh, the 80s in America. Neon colors, shoulder pads, and the mullet. Bon Jovi and Madonna dancing on MTV. Unless, of course, you were watching another episode of Miami Vice. Everything seems so carefree at first glance, doesn't it? But if you shake off this first layer, you'll find a deeper, dark fear spreading across the nation. People are whispering about secret evil lurking in their neighborhoods, about children in danger, and about a force so terrible, so powerful, that it can take the soul of any living being. This was real life during what we now call the Satanic Panic, and it's against this backdrop that one of the most chilling true crime stories unfolded, a tale of carnival workers, dark rituals, and a brutal murder that would shock the nation. Welcome to Cults Uncovered. This is the chilling story of the Carny Cult murders. Before we dive into the details, we need to understand the bizarre world that made them possible. So we're about to take a wild ride through one of the strangest periods in recent American history, when the states lost its mind. See, the 1980s weren't just about MTV and Ronald Reagan. It was a time when fear gripped the nation. Fear of an invisible enemy that supposedly lurked in every shadow. This enemy, satanic cults. Back then, millions of Americans were convinced that secret groups of devil worshippers were everywhere, snatching children, abusing them in horrific rituals and corrupting the youth with heavy metal music and Dungeons and Dragons. Well, come to think of it, this reality isn't all that different from today's. So let's say the setting is different, with bigger hairstyles and Guns N' Roses blasting louder. But how did this mass hysteria start? Well, it's a perfect storm of factors. The country was changing fast. More moms were working outside the home, leaving kids in daycare. The religious right was gaining power, preaching about family values and the dangers of straying from the path of righteousness. And after years of sweeping the issue under the rug, all anxieties came to a boil with the release of a book called Michelle Remembers in 1980. This book, written by a Canadian psychiatrist and his patient, claimed to reveal shocking recovered memories of satanic ritual abuse. It was total fiction, but it hit a nerve. Suddenly, people had a face for their fears. The evil Satanist, out to corrupt and destroy everything good and pure. So, naturally, the panic spread like wildfire. Parents started seeing danger everywhere. Daycares became suspected hotbeds of satanic activity. Heavy metal bands were accused of hiding evil messages in their music. Even Procter & Gamble, the company that makes your toothpaste, your shampoo, had to publicly deny that its logo was a secret satanic symbol. But you know how it goes. People start talking and talking, and the media rides the wave to get in on the action. Talk shows and news programs ran sensational stories about satanic cults. In 1985, the news program 2020 aired a segment claiming Satan was alive and thriving in America. 3 years later, nearly 20 million people tuned in to watch Geraldo Rivera's 2-hour special on satanic cults. Law enforcement got caught up in the hysteria too. Police departments held seminars on identifying occult symbols and satanic crime scenes. The FBI was flooded with calls about suspected ritual abuse. It got so bad that in 1992, FBI agent Ken Lanning had to release a report debunking most of these claims. But here's the scary part. People went to prison over this stuff. Hundreds were charged with crimes related to satanic ritual abuse. Many were convicted and spent years behind bars before being exonerated. The most famous case was probably the McMartin preschool trial, where childcare workers were accused of crimes against kids in secret underground tunnels. It was the longest and most expensive criminal trial in U.S. history at the time, and it ended with no convictions. By the mid-90s, the panic started to die down as people realized there was no evidence for these wild claims. But the damage was done. Lives were ruined, families torn apart, and a climate of fear and suspicion had taken root in many communities. And it's in this nice climate that our story takes place. A story that proves sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding in the shadows behind upside-down crosses. They're right out in the open, working at your local carnival. Now let's zoom in on a particular group of carnival workers in the fall of 1991. They're setting up for the DeKalb County Free Fall Fair in Auburn, Indiana. On the surface, it looks like any other traveling carnival. Bright lights, loud music, the smell of fried food in the air. But behind the scenes, something much darker is happening. Meet our cast of characters: Jimmy Lee Pennick, Mark Goodwin, and brothers Keith and David Lawrence. Typical carnies? No, not quite. Sure, they travel from town to town, setting up rides and running games, but they've got a hobby that's a lot more sinister than scamming people out of their money at the ring toss. These 4 men are part of a secretive satanic cult. But what made this group of devil lovers different from the others? Well, to start with, this isn't some imaginary group of devil worshippers invented by paranoid parents. This is a real cult with real beliefs, and as we'll soon see, real victims. These guys aren't just playing around with pentagrams and black candles. They're true believers, and they're dangerous. Their leader is Jimmy Lee Pennick. He's got a history of violence and a magnetic personality that draws others into his twisted world. The Lawrence brothers and Goodwin look up to him, eager to prove themselves worthy of the dark powers they believe Pennick can access. Their belief system is a mishmash of occult ideas, heavy metal lyrics, and good old-fashioned sadism. They're convinced that by performing certain rituals, they can gain supernatural powers. Now, when I say rituals, I'm not talking about lighting a candle under a full moon or using quartz crystals. We're talking blood, pain, and ultimately, murder. The group had already committed one killing earlier that year in Fulton County, Ohio. An 18-year-old boy fell victim to their dark desires. But for Pennick, that wasn't enough. He was always looking for the next thrill, the next sacrifice to prove his devotion to the dark forces he worshipped. That's when William Anthony Alt enters. He's another carnival worker, a young guy just trying to make a living on the fair circuit. Alt starts hanging around with Pennick's crew, fascinated by their talk of secret knowledge and occult powers. He wants in on their satanic church. But there's a problem. Alt knows about the murder in Ohio. Maybe he heard the guys talking about it one night after too many beers. Maybe someone bragged to impress him. However it happened, Alt now has information that could destroy the group. So Pennick and his followers come up with a plan. They'll initiate Alt into their group. As the fair in Auburn winds down for the night on September 25, 1991, the carnies start packing up. But for Alt and the cultists, the real show is about to begin. The air is crisp on that September night as a group of 5 men pile into a car driven by a woman named Brenda Ferguson. William Alt thinks he's on his way to join a secret society, to gain powers beyond his wildest dreams. He has no idea he's riding to his doom. Ferguson drives them to a secluded farm building north of Auburn. It's the perfect spot for a clandestine ritual, or a brutal murder. As they get out of the car, Alt might have felt a twinge of nervousness, but it's too late to back out now. Inside the abandoned building, the cultists get to work. They improvise an altar using an old door they find lying around. It's not fancy, but it'll do the job. They tell Alt to lie down on this makeshift altar. He complies, probably thinking this is all part of the initiation. That's when things start to get too real. The other men tie Alt up and gag him. Maybe this is when he realizes something is very, very wrong. But trussed up like that, there's nothing he can do now. Keith Lawrence, one of the brothers, starts the ritual. He reads out an invocation to Satan, his voice echoing in the empty building. The others stand around, watching, waiting for what comes next. Jimmy Lee Pennick steps forward. He's holding Keith's knife. Without warning, he slashes Alt from neck to stomach. The cut is deep, and Alt's blood begins to pour out onto the improvised altar. But they're not done. Not by a long shot. One by one, Pennick, Goodwin, and the Lawrence brothers take turns cutting Alt's chest and abdomen. They carve an inverted cross into his flesh, a mockery of Christian symbolism and a tribute to their dark master. Alt is in agony, but the gag muffles his screams. Imagine the terror he must have felt in those moments, realizing that this wasn't an initiation, it was an execution. As Alt's life ebbs away, Pennick leans in close. "Are you ready to die?" he asks. Alt manages some kind of response, we don't know what. Maybe a plea for mercy, maybe defiance. Whatever it was the last thing he ever said. Pennick takes the knife and slits Alt's throat. But the horror isn't over. Not satisfied with merely killing Alt, the cultists decide to dismember his body. They cut off his head and hands, perhaps thinking this will make identification harder if the body is found. Then, in a macabre attempt to destroy evidence, they try to burn these body parts. The smell of burning flesh must have been overwhelming in that enclosed space. With their grisly work done, the cultists dispose of Alt's remains, scattering them in a field. Then, in a final act of insensitivity that shows just how detached from normal human feeling they are, they use money stolen from their victim to buy food at an Arby's. Yes, food at an Arby's. These men have just committed a horrific murder, mutilated a body, and now they're casually munching on roast beef sandwiches. It's almost too much to comprehend. As dawn breaks over Auburn, Indiana, William Alt lies dead and dismembered in a field. The carnival where he worked is packing up, moving on to the next town, and his killers are already planning their next move, confident that their dark deed will remain hidden. But these kinds of secrets, so big and bloody, sooner or later come to light. Sure, for a while it seemed like the cultists might get away with their crime. The carnival packed up and moved on, taking the killers with it. William Alt was just another drifter, the kind of person who can disappear without anyone asking too many questions. But the cultists made one key mistake. They talked. Mark Goodwin, perhaps racked with guilt or maybe just unable to keep such a big secret, confided in his father about the murder. Goodwin's father, faced with the knowledge of this horrific crime, did what many of us hope we'd have the courage to do in that situation. He went to the police. The tip led investigators to the field where Alt's body had been dumped. What they found there was the Alt's mutilated body, bearing the marks of the savage ritual it had endured. An unimaginable cruelty they saw. As detectives began to dig deeper, they knew that they weren't dealing with just a random act of violence or a robbery gone wrong. This was something far more sinister. The investigation spread across state lines as authorities realized the group had committed an earlier murder in Ohio. They were dealing with a mobile group of killers, using the carnival circuit as cover for their deadly activities. One by one, the cultists were rounded up. Jimmy Lee Pennick, the ringleader, was arrested along with Keith and David Lawrence and Mark Goodwin. Brenda Ferguson, who had driven the group to the murder site, was also taken into custody. There, they spoke of gaining power through violence, of communing with dark forces through bloodshed. Some of it sounded like the ramblings of disturbed minds, but the physical evidence backed up the horror of their claims. People couldn't believe it. Their worst fears had come true. Here in the heartland of America, a satanic cult had been operating right under everyone's noses. It seemed to confirm the worst fears that had been circulating during the Satanic Panic. But unlike many of the sensationalized cases of the era, this one was all too real. There was physical evidence. There were confessions. There was a real victim and real killers. As the case moved towards trial, prosecutors faced the challenge of presenting these almost unbelievable facts to a jury. How do you explain such senseless, ritualistic violence? How do you make sense of the nonsensical? Jimmy Lee Pennick, as the ringleader and the one who dealt the fatal blow to William Alt, faced the most serious charges. Likely trying to save himself from the death penalty, Pennick decided to plead guilty to murder. So, on November 23, 1993, Pennick stood before a judge in DeKalb Circuit Court. The prosecution laid out the horrific details of the crime, the ritual murder, the mutilation, the cold-blooded way Pennick and his followers had treated Alt's life as a sacrificial offering to their twisted beliefs. The judge, clearly disturbed by the facts of the case, didn't hold back. He listed 10 aggravating factors, painting a picture of Pennick as a remorseless killer with a history of violence. The judge noted how Pennick had bound and gagged Alt, rendering him defenseless before subjecting him to torture. He spoke of the pain Alt must have endured, the gruesome dismemberment of his body, and the macabre way Pennick had used the dead man's money for a fast food meal after the killing. But in the end, the judge handed down the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement, 60 years in prison. This sentence was to be served consecutively with another sentence Pennick was already facing for the earlier murder in Ohio. This way, society made sure that this monster would never walk among them again. Now, what about the others? They didn't fare much better. Keith Lawrence, who had played a significant role in the ritual and the killing, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to 50 years with 20 years suspended, meaning he'd serve 30 years behind bars before facing 20 years of probation. David Lawrence and Mark Goodwin, while not as deeply involved in the actual killing, were still party to the horrific crime. They both pleaded guilty to charges of assisting a criminal. Each received 8-year sentences. There's also Brenda Ferguson, who, as we know, drove the group to the murder site. She was also brought to justice, but the details of her sentencing aren't very clear. What is very clear, though, is that the monsters had been caught, tried, and locked away. Justice had been served. This was the case of the Carny Cult murders. I'm sure you won't look at carnivals the same way from now on. And while it's true that much of the Satanic Panic was exaggerated, as you can see, the fear of hidden evil wasn't entirely unfounded. So, watch out for the shadows, but even more so for the living. What do you think about satanic cults? Do you think some of them are still out there? Please let us know in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Check out our other stories by clicking the card on the screen. Always remember, beware the leader and never drink the Kool-Aid.